Victorian parents had a very special gift: the ability to look directly at a situation that was obviously dangerous, unhealthy, or wildly irresponsible, and confidently call it good parenting. Today, we panic if a toddler climbs 2 steps without a helmet. But in the Victorian era, parents were handing children responsibilities, chores, and life challenges that would make a modern family lawyer appear out of thin air, like a summoned demon. It was a world where childhood wasn't a protected phase of life. It was simply the unpaid internship before adulthood, except with more soot, stricter morals, and far fewer snack breaks. Picture a city wrapped in coal smoke thick enough to taste, streets crowded with horses, factory whistles screaming at dawn, and homes packed so tightly that privacy was something only the rich could spell. This was where Victorian children were expected to flourish, ideally quietly, obediently, and without too many complaints that might embarrass the parents. Families genuinely believed they were raising strong, virtuous future adults. But by today's standards, most of their normal choices would come with a visit from child services, 3 safety inspectors, and probably a documentary titled, "How Did Humanity Survive This?" Victorian parenting operated on a few powerful forces: industrial necessity, religious morals, fear of social shame, and a generous dash of questionable medical advice. Children were loved, of course, but affection was often hidden beneath layers of discipline, duty, and the deeply held belief that emotional softness created weak character. A child who expressed feelings was gently guided toward silence. A child who resisted chores was encouraged with consequences that would be wildly illegal today. And a child who survived long enough to reach adulthood, well, that was proof the system worked. But let's be fair, they weren't intentionally trying to traumatize their offspring. They simply lived in a world where danger was an everyday roommate. Diseases with dramatic names, water that wasn't always safe to drink, factories that didn't know the meaning of the word safety, and moral expectations that would make a drill sergeant sweat. Victorian parents weren't cruel. They were operating with the tools, beliefs, and limited scientific understanding of their time. Unfortunately for their children, those tools included things like opium cough syrup, child-sized cleaning brushes, and a disciplinary philosophy best described as extreme character development. As we step into this world, chapter by chapter, we'll explore the parenting methods that Victorians considered completely reasonable, methods that today would spark emergency meetings, government investigations, or at the very least, several angry parenting blogs. From their ideas about newborns to their approach to education, work, discipline, health, emotions, and the daunting launch into adulthood, we're going to walk through every stage of a Victorian childhood. And with each step, you'll probably find yourself asking the same question: how did any of these children grow up? So sit back, relax, breathe in the imaginary coal fumes, and prepare to visit a century where parenting wasn't just different, it was a survival challenge disguised as moral guidance. Welcome to the Victorian era, and welcome to the many, many reasons why Victorian parenting would be absolutely, unquestionably illegal today. You weren't really born into the Victorian world so much as you were dropped into it like a tiny, confused contestant in a survival game show. The moment a Victorian baby arrived, the clock started ticking, not toward childhood milestones, but toward the biggest question of all. Will this small, squishy human actually make it past infancy? Parents certainly cared, of course. They just had, let's call it, a different approach. The kind of approach where love was expressed through stoicism, questionable medical advice, and the occasional moral lecture delivered to someone who could barely focus their eyes. Imagine your first moments on Earth. Dim room, a midwife who has seen more chaos than a battlefield, and a hygiene routine that consisted mostly of wiping things down with whatever cloth was nearest. Babies entered the world greeted by concerned adults who fully believed that an infant was basically a fragile, unpredictable bundle of moral weakness. Victorians were convinced that even newborns came preloaded with the potential for sin. A modern parent sees a baby cry and thinks, "Aw, they're hungry." A Victorian parent saw the same cry and thought, "This child is already manipulating me." No pressure, little one. The home environment didn't help. Most families lived in cramped, damp rooms where air circulation relied on hope more than architecture. Windows were often sealed shut because fresh air was suspicious, and drafts were believed to cause everything from colds to character flaws. Babies slept in cribs so close to the parent's bed that one wrong elbow at night might accidentally contribute to the infant mortality statistics, which were already incredibly high. And yet, Victorians found comfort in routine. Swaddle tightly, pray fervently, and trust that God and the midwife were handling everything the parents didn't quite understand. Speaking of swaddling, Victorian parents were, how to put this politely, very enthusiastic about wrapping their babies like burritos. To modern eyes, the result often looks like a baby disguised as an oddly shaped loaf of bread. The belief was that tight wrapping prevented deformities because Victorians assumed babies were soft clay that needed shaping. Some even believed that holding a baby too often would physically weaken it, so parents proudly practiced a hands-off approach that today would spark a dozen concerned phone calls. Then came the feeding. Modern parents read articles with titles like, "Signs Your Baby is Ready for Solid Foods." Victorian parents relied on advice from newspapers, neighbors, and occasionally a doctor who prescribed biscuits, beer, or broth that had probably been sitting out for days. Infant formula didn't exist yet, so if breastfeeding wasn't possible, families turned to wet nurses, animal milk, or mixtures that nutritionists today would classify under absolutely not. Contaminated bottles, unsterilized feeding tubes, and milk that had seen better days were all common. But Victorian parents, armed with limited information, firmly believed they were doing their best. After all, if the baby kept crying, wasn't that just proof they were building lung strength? Parents also had a deep trust in both home remedies and medical gadgets that would cause modern doctors to stare silently into the distance. If a baby fussed, they might receive a dose of something soothing, which occasionally contained alcohol, opium, or a mixture of herbs with ominous names like soothing syrup. These remedies came in elegant bottles, printed with claims that could only be described as wildly ambitious. Cures all infant troubles, one might say, while quietly omitting the part where it also made the baby sleep so deeply that parents occasionally worried the child had simply checked out of life altogether. But Victorian parents weren't monsters. They were operating in a world where medical science was like a toddler learning to walk, eager, enthusiastic, and prone to falling face first into bad ideas. They believed these treatments helped. And honestly, compared to the terrifying diseases of the era, a little questionable syrup probably felt like mercy. Once the initial medical confusion was handled, parents turned their attention to shaping the baby's moral character because the Victorians loved nothing more than a good moral lesson. And nothing said, "Good morning, little one," like being raised in a home where everything, from crying too loudly to crawling in the wrong direction, risked being interpreted as a sign of potential moral doom. Babies weren't seen as blank slates. They were viewed as tiny humans already teetering on the edge of misbehavior, requiring vigilance to prevent future chaos. This belief affected early parenting in dramatic ways. Babies were taught stillness, silence, and self-control long before they were capable of grasping what these things meant. If a baby squirmed too much, parents gently corrected them. If a baby cried excessively, it wasn't treated as an infant need. It was viewed as a character challenge. Emotional expression was handled with the same stern energy someone might use to negotiate tax fraud allegations. And yet, for all their strict beliefs, Victorian parents were incredibly proud of their children. They just had a very different way of showing it. A modern parent might say, "You're doing great, sweetie." A Victorian parent expressed the same sentiment with a polite nod, a note in a diary, or an extra spoonful of porridge. Their love was quiet, serious, and filtered through a worldview shaped by survival, faith, and the constant presence of illness. To them, preparing a child for life meant toughening them early. The physical environment didn't make life easier. Industrial cities were loud, polluted, and filled with hazards that no one seemed particularly worried about. Babies breathed in coal-dusted air as casually as oxygen. Water quality varied wildly, and households did not yet grasp the concept of germs, so everything was considered clean unless it looked like it had been through battle. Infants crawled across floors that saw daily traffic from shoes, mud, and occasionally small animals. Yet parents trusted that exposure builds strength, a phrase that has aged about as well as Victorian plumbing. Infancy was also the period when mothers and fathers began preparing children for their future roles. Yes, even before the child could sit up. Boys were expected to grow into workers, girls into caretakers and homemakers. Parents made choices about toys, clothing, and interactions based on what they believed would build proper gendered behavior. A girl given too much independence was seen as dangerously bold. A boy showing too much emotion? A red flag, clearly. So even before toddlers discovered their own feet, their life paths were being gently nudged into place. All these early pressures came wrapped in the Victorian belief that children were resilient and adaptable, which, to be fair, many were. But the real reason Victorian infancy was so intense had less to do with parenting philosophy and more to do with survival math. Many families had multiple children because losing one or several was heartbreakingly common. Parents desperately wanted their babies to survive. They just didn't always have the tools, knowledge, or resources to ensure it. By the time a child reached the toddler stage, parents breathed a small, cautious sigh of relief. Not because the dangers were gone, but because the child had proven themselves sturdy enough to handle the next round of Victorian life challenges. And if you thought infancy was rough, well, Victorian early childhood had its own thrilling set of surprises waiting on the horizon. By the time a Victorian child made it past infancy, parents developed a cautious but genuine sense of optimism. Not celebration. You didn't celebrate too loudly in a century where illness lurked in every drafty corner, but a quiet, internal sigh of relief. If the child could crawl, wobble, and occasionally shout at inopportune times, That meant they had a fighting chance of reaching the next level of Victorian childhood. And now that survival wasn't the sole focus, parents could finally shift their attention to what really mattered to them, shaping character, enforcing discipline, and ensuring the child didn't embarrass the family in public. Victorian toddlers lived in a world that combined strict expectations with a stunning lack of basic safety measures. Imagine a house with open flames, unstable furniture, boiling kettles, and floorboards that creaked with secrets. And then imagine expecting a 2-year-old to navigate all of that without supervision while remaining quiet, obedient, and morally upright. Modern toddlers throw tantrums when their snack is the wrong shape. Victorian toddlers learned very quickly that expressing strong opinions wasn't a recommended hobby. Each morning, a child would wake up in a cramped bedroom that smelled faintly of damp wood, coal smoke, and the occasional medicinal tincture. If the family was poor, the child most likely slept in the same room as siblings, parents, and sometimes neighbors, all squeezed into a space smaller than a modern walk-in closet. Privacy wasn't a thing, personal space wasn't a thing. The concept of my toys definitely wasn't a thing, because toys were luxuries, unless you counted sticks, scraps, or objects found in the garden, in which case the Victorians were surrounded by an abundance of fun. Parents didn't start the day with gentle affirmations or warm emotional pep talks. The Victorian morning routine began with instructions, chores to do, rules to follow, and please, for the love of all things respectable, try not to stain your clothes within the first 3 minutes of being awake. Cleanliness wasn't just a preference, it was a moral responsibility. A dirty child didn't simply look unwashed, they looked undisciplined, untrained, and potentially on a slippery slope toward moral ruin. Breakfast wasn't the comforting ritual modern families imagine either. There was no colorful cereal, no cheerful fruit slices, no adorable toddler sippy cup. Victorian children might receive porridge, thick enough to patch a wall, bread, slightly stale but still edible if chewed long enough, or maybe a bit of weak tea, because hydration standards were flexible. Parents considered this perfectly sufficient. A child complaining about flavor or texture would be met with a look that said, "Eat it, or you'll enjoy the sensation of becoming hungrier later." After breakfast, the real parenting began. Victorian parents viewed early childhood as the ideal time to mold behavior, which meant toddlers were introduced to obedience with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a grand invention. Children were taught to sit still, stand straight, and stay quiet in situations where modern kids would be allowed to run laps around a park. Victorian society valued restraint, and parents believed that self-control had to be instilled as early as possible, preferably before the child could pronounce the word self. Speaking out of turn was a common toddler hobby, and Victorians had little patience for it. A child who interrupted adults wasn't adorable, they were disrespectful. A child who wandered off wasn't curious, they were disobedient. And a child who cried loudly in public, that was a public relations crisis. Victorian parents were constantly on alert, guarding against any behavior that might make neighbors whisper. Reputation was everything. Children weren't just children, they were tiny ambassadors of family discipline. Of course, the ironic twist here is that while parents demanded impeccable manners, the physical world around toddlers was absolute chaos. Streets were filled with horses, cartwheels, mud, stray dogs, and suspicious puddles. Homes had open fireplaces, sharp tools, and cleaning chemicals stored in places that modern safety experts would faint at. The expectation was not keep the child safe, it was the child must learn not to be reckless. Essentially, toddlers were trained to avoid danger through a combination of stern warnings, pointed glances, and the occasional, "Well, that's what happens when you don't listen." Parents also emphasized chores early in life. Children were expected to contribute to the household, not out of cruelty, but because survival demanded teamwork. A 3-year-old might help with sweeping, dusting, or carrying small items. A slightly older child might fetch water, mind younger siblings, or help clean the fireplace. The kind of task that would make a modern childcare expert need a long walk in the fresh air. Victorian parents didn't see chores as burdens. They believed work built character, discipline, and usefulness. And in a time when every member of the household had a role, toddlers weren't exempt. But the real emotional shaping happened in the quieter moments. Affection existed, of course, but Victorian affection was subtle, controlled, and rarely expressed through physical gestures. Parents believed too much cuddling created weakness, too much praise encouraged vanity, too much gentleness softened the spirit. So love was delivered through practical actions: a mended shirt, a warm meal, a patient explanation of a moral lesson. To a modern viewer, Victorian parents might look distant. To Victorians, they were demonstrating responsible restraint. Still, there were moments of genuine warmth: a mother humming while mending a child's clothing, a father lifting a toddler to look out the window at the street below, older siblings teaching little ones how to tie ribbons or polish shoes. These moments were small but meaningful, tucked between the harsher realities of Victorian life. Love wasn't absent, it was simply shaped by the world's hard edges. As children grew, parents also introduced them to Victorian moral culture. Stories with heavy lessons, cautionary poems, and illustrations designed to discourage misbehavior. You didn't just learn not to touch the stove, you learned that children who touch stoves grow up to be cautionary tales whispered at bedtime. Victorian parenting relied heavily on fear of consequences, both physical and moral. A toddler's imagination could run wild, but Victorian parents were right behind it, steering it firmly toward obedience. Even playtime, when it existed, carried moral undertones. Children were encouraged to play quietly, politely, and within sight. Wild play was frowned upon unless it built physical strength or toughness. Toys, if available, often resembled adult tools: miniature sewing kits, tiny gardening tools, small brooms. Victorian parents believed children should spend their free time preparing for future responsibilities, not indulging in frivolous amusement. But for all the expectations and structure, Victorian parents weren't trying to break their children, they were trying to prepare them. They believed the world was harsh, unpredictable, and morally dangerous, and children needed strength to survive in it. Their strictness came from fear as much as confidence. Poverty, illness, and social judgment constantly hovered in the background. A parent couldn't afford to be relaxed. A single mistake could lead to consequences far more severe than a timeout. And as the child grew older, the stakes only got higher. A toddler might splash in a puddle. A slightly older child might be expected to learn skills directly to survival. Victorian parents didn't just want obedient children, they needed competent ones. The moment a child could walk steadily and follow basic instructions, the world outside the home waited with open, industrial arms. This is where the next stage of Victorian parenting began, preparing the child for work, responsibility, and the endless grind of adulthood that began long before anyone finished growing. Childhood wasn't a sanctuary, it was training. And for many Victorian families, training didn't stop at chores or moral lessons. Eventually, there came a moment when the parents looked at their small, still growing child and decided it was time for the next step, a step that would shape the rest of their life. Because once early childhood was over, the world outside the home wasn't just calling, it was demanding. By the time a Victorian child reached the age where they could walk without falling into the hearth or spill porridge on the floor, parents had already started eyeing the next milestone, work. And when I say work, I don't mean a gentle chore that teaches responsibility. I mean full-on labor, often in factories, fields, or coal mines, under conditions that would make a modern workplace inspector faint at the sight of a single cogwheel. Victorian parents did not think of this as cruelty. They thought of it as preparation. Survival wasn't guaranteed, and the family needed every able hand. Childhood, as we understand it today, was a luxury most could not afford. It began quietly at first. Toddlers were encouraged to help with household tasks, sweeping, fetching water, minding younger siblings. These weren't optional. A child who refused to carry a kettle or sweep the floor wasn't simply lazy. They were a disappointment, a risk to the household's well-being. Parents had little patience for complaints. Every action, every chore was tied to lessons in discipline, responsibility, and moral development. And while the tasks themselves were mundane, the stakes were astonishingly high. Failure wasn't just frowned upon. It could lead to practical consequences, like hunger or punishment, both of which were regular tools in a Victorian parent's toolkit. Once the child could handle these small responsibilities, the outside world beckoned. Factories, workshops, and trades didn't wait for maturity. Parents routinely sent their children to work as early as 6 or 7 years old, believing that practical experience and earned wages were crucial components of character. The modern mind struggles to imagine a first grader laboring in a textile mill, dodging flying machinery, and still being expected to survive the day. Yet this was normal. Wages were minimal, hours were long, and the idea of child labor laws simply didn't exist. Parents rationalized it in one simple phrase: necessity. The family needed the income, and the child needed to learn industry and obedience. What better way to combine lessons with survival? For some children, work meant factories where spinning machines hummed with relentless energy. The clatter of looms was deafening, but silence was not an option. One mistake could maim or kill. Victorian parents didn't coddle their children about these dangers. They emphasized awareness, precision, and endurance. Failure wasn't framed as a tragic lesson. It was framed as a personal shortcoming, something that could be corrected with discipline, diligence, and another 10-hour shift. The child's survival itself was considered evidence of their strength and moral fortitude. Others were sent to mines, where the air was thick with coal dust and danger lurked in every shaft. Parents believed this exposure would toughen them, and indeed, it did, physically, mentally, and morally. Exposure to real danger created what Victorians called character. Modern parents might call it trauma, but in the 19th century, resilience was everything, and character was the currency by which society measured worth. A child who could survive a day underground, crawling through tight spaces and hauling heavy loads, was a child who could survive life itself. Then there were chimney sweeps. a particularly grim form of childhood labor. Tiny children were sent up narrow flues to clean soot from chimneys, earning pennies for a day's worth of near impossible work. Parents didn't watch this happen, they simply arranged it. The logic was simple. Small bodies could reach places adults couldn't, and earning a wage, even a pittance, was better than being idle. And if the work was dangerous or deadly, well, that was life. Victorian children were expected to navigate risk constantly because the world outside the home was a dangerous place, and early experience was the best teacher. Besides, child labor provided opportunities for advancement within the working-class world. A boy who survived his first year in a factory might someday run a small workshop himself. A girl who endured long hours at a textile mill might support her family and eventually marry into security. Education and work weren't mutually exclusive, though schooling was often minimal. Some children attended schools, usually after a day of labor or during limited hours. Others learned trades directly under the watchful eye of a master or parent. Victorian parents valued practical knowledge above imaginative play. Children weren't encouraged to daydream. They were encouraged to observe, replicate, and perfect the skills necessary to contribute to the household and the economy. A child who excelled in math or reading? Lucky. But a child who could carry water, sweep floors, or tend animals? That was survival. That was victory. Discipline remained intertwined with work. A child who shirked a task risked not only punishment, but moral judgment. Victorian parents equated obedience with virtue, diligence with morality. Children internalized these lessons from their earliest days, long before they could fully understand why adults seemed so obsessed with effort, endurance, and control. Work was both a practical necessity and a moral crucible. By the time children reached 8 or 9, the lesson was clear. Life is hard, and you must be harder. Even the youngest workers developed a sense of responsibility that modern children rarely experience. Carrying water from wells, tending to animals, and fetching coal required precision and timing. Parents expected children to remember instructions, avoid accidents, and complete tasks without complaint. There was little room for error, no space for indecision. Every action reflected on the family's reputation and the child's perceived character. Mistakes weren't excuses. They were lessons delivered with a firm hand, sometimes literally. However, Victorian parents weren't just about physical labor. Emotional resilience was part of the curriculum too. Children observed their parents' reactions to stress, illness, and social pressure. They learned to mask fear, to control frustration, and to approach challenges with stoic endurance. A child who wept openly over minor hardship might receive a gentle scolding, a silent stare, or an extra chore, all intended to teach composure. Affection existed, but it was subtle, carefully measured, and often tied to performance. Praise was rare, endurance was the reward. Parents also prepared children for inevitable hardships beyond the household. Sickness, poverty, and social scrutiny were constant companions. A child who survived minor accidents, illness, or exposure to dangerous conditions was considered strong, morally and physically. Victorian children learned early that life was a test of resilience, and parents were both guides and taskmasters in this curriculum. The world outside the home was merciless. Inside, parents were merciful only in proportion to the child's ability to meet expectations. And yet, for all the intensity, Victorian parenting wasn't cruel in intent. Parents often made arrangements to ensure their children were employed safely by the standards of the day. Apprenticeships, factory placements, and other work opportunities were chosen to benefit the family and, ostensibly, the child's future. The logic was simple. A child who learned to work hard would contribute to the family, develop moral character, and eventually rise above the risks of poverty. The world demanded survival, and parents gave their children the tools to meet it, even if those tools would horrify modern sensibilities. At the end of the day, work was woven into the very fabric of childhood. Play, leisure, and innocence were secondary to practical skill and endurance. Even toys, if available, were designed to mimic adult responsibilities: miniature brooms, tiny sewing kits, small tools. Learning through work was the default method. Mistakes were corrected quickly, lessons were enforced through repetition, and character was built through experience, often at the child's expense. Victorian parents believed that adversity created strength, and every chore, every task, and every day of labor was a step toward producing a competent, morally upright adult. By the time a child reached the threshold of adolescence, the lessons were deeply ingrained. They could navigate chores, assist the household, handle minor emergencies, and endure discomfort without complaint. They were prepared, physically, mentally, and morally, for the next stage of Victorian life: stricter discipline, more dangerous labor, and the dawning realization that childhood was, in truth, a brief and intensely practical prelude to adulthood. Childhood in the Victorian era wasn't a protected period. It was a rigorous apprenticeship, a relentless lesson in survival, responsibility, and moral fortitude. And parents weren't merely instructing, they were shaping, testing, and sometimes even challenging their children at every moment, convinced that the skills learned today would safeguard them tomorrow. In a world where death and danger lurked around every corner, labor wasn't punishment. It was preparation. And every Victorian parent believed, with absolute certainty, that their children would be stronger for it. The next stage of this brutal but strangely loving education would expand beyond chores and work. Discipline, morality, and societal expectation awaited, ready to leave a permanent mark on every child fortunate enough to survive the early years. If you thought Victorian childhood was challenging before, you haven't yet met the centerpiece of their upbringing: discipline. It wasn't just a tool or a guideline, it was the very framework of life. Modern parents whisper about timeouts or the occasional gentle correction. Victorians had a different philosophy entirely. Discipline wasn't a suggestion, a method, or a parenting option. It was the law of the household, enforced with unwavering seriousness, and sometimes a healthy dose of creative imagination. To the Victorians, it was simple. A child who wasn't disciplined was a child who was morally, socially, and physically unfit for the world, and the world, in turn, was merciless. Discipline began early, shockingly early. Toddlers who might trip over a hearth or spill porridge weren't just corrected for accidents. Their early missteps were interpreted as moral failings. A child who cried too much? Whining was treated as evidence of weakness. A child who resisted chores? Laziness was a moral flaw, not a passing mood. Victorian parents were tireless in their observations, watching for every sign of character deficiency, ready to correct, redirect, or punish with the efficiency of a general in a well-oiled army. Every gesture, glance, or muttered word could trigger instruction or consequence. The methods were varied, and they reflected the era's obsession with order, restraint, and moral fortitude. Spanking was common. often rationalized as a necessary guide for developing conscience. The logic was elegantly cruel. Pain teaches lessons faster than words. A child who understood fear early could navigate society with caution and virtue. Canes, straps, and even specialized implements existed, not for cruelty's sake, though a modern mind would surely disagree, but because Victorians believed in shaping children's moral fiber before they fully developed the capacity for rebellion. It was proactive, albeit harsh. But physical discipline was only one layer. Victorian parenting was obsessed with psychological molding as well. Shame was a primary tool. Public embarrassment could be administered at home or in community settings. A child who misbehaved at dinner might be seated alone, under silent scrutiny, while family members exchanged glances that communicated subtle yet intense disapproval. Children learned quickly that behavior had social consequences, that their actions reflected on the household, and that emotional displays could be weaponized by authority figures. Fear and shame were, in this context, considered essential ingredients for moral education. Lectures were another staple. Long, serious monologues about right and wrong, virtue and vice, and the eternal consequences of disobedience were delivered with unwavering intensity. Parents assumed toddlers could grasp these lessons, or at least absorb them subconsciously through repetition and gravity of tone. Modern audiences might smile at the image of a 3-year-old receiving a lecture on sin, virtue, and responsibility, but to the Victorians, it was simply preparation. Moral literacy, they believed, started before the child could even tie their own shoes. Mistakes were treated as opportunities for reinforcement, not forgiveness. Spill the milk? That was a chance to practice caution and obedience. Wandered off while running errands? A lecture, a scolding, and maybe a chore added to your list. Crying or complaining wasn't merely annoying, it was proof that the child's moral compass required correction. Victorian parents assumed children could be shaped, molded, and guided toward a future of virtue. The idea of indulgence, comfort, or emotional leniency was largely absent. Discipline extended beyond the household. Schools, apprenticeships, and religious institutions all reinforced the same principles. Corporal punishment was standard, and the moral reasoning behind it was universally accepted. Teachers and masters viewed strict correction as preparation for life, not punishment for its own sake. Parents actively supported these methods, believing that consistency between home and public authority was critical for a child's development. Obedience was cultivated through relentless reinforcement, and children internalized the hierarchy of authority at a very young age. Even play was affected by discipline. Activities were designed to instill order, patience, and attention to rules. Games that encouraged imagination without structure were often discouraged or redirected. Toys mimicked adult responsibilities. Dolls for young girls to practice domestic roles, miniature brooms and tools for boys to imitate labor. Children learned early that amusement was valuable only when it prepared them for life, not merely for pleasure. Every hour of the day was another opportunity to practice control, endurance, and moral fortitude. Victorian parents also wielded expectations as a subtle, pervasive form of discipline. Children were acutely aware of what was expected, not just from a practical standpoint, but morally. Deviating from these expectations wasn't just frowned upon, it was evidence of personal and familial failure. Siblings were often enlisted in this system, policing each other's behavior, and reinforcing lessons through peer pressure and shared understanding of consequences. From the earliest years, children became experts in self-regulation because survival, approval, and even affection depended on it. Yet discipline wasn't only about punishment or shaping behavior. It was framed as an expression of care, a method to equip children for a brutal world. Victorian society was unforgiving. Illness, poverty, industrial accidents, and social judgment loomed constantly. Parents were acutely aware that their children would face harsh realities beyond the home. Discipline, harsh as it seems, was a way to arm the next generation with the tools to endure. Strictness was synonymous with love, at least in the Victorian mind. Interestingly, humor and storytelling were occasionally woven into disciplinary strategies. Cautionary tales, often grim, sometimes bordering on macabre, taught lessons through fear, illustration, and imagination. Tales of naughty children meeting unpleasant fates were staples of nursery reading. The moral was clear: misbehavior had consequences, and those consequences could be severe. Children internalized these lessons early, learning that personal responsibility, compliance, and careful attention were essential not only for approval, but for survival itself. As children matured, discipline evolved into expectation. Toddlers who had learned the basics of obedience now faced tasks demanding endurance, responsibility, and self-control. Early mistakes were corrected with more significant consequences. Small tasks became bigger challenges, and the lessons of early childhood, control, restraint, moral awareness, were reinforced constantly. Victorian parents didn't just punish, they cultivated a mindset designed to withstand the relentless demands of industrial life, societal scrutiny, and moral oversight. By the time a child reached the edge of adolescence, they had internalized a complex system of expectations. Every action, from speaking politely to completing chores, was tied to moral reasoning, social reputation, and personal endurance. Parents had carefully constructed a network of lessons, consequences, and reinforcement strategies designed to produce an obedient, capable, morally literate adult. And in a society where mistakes could lead to serious harm or public shame, this rigorous approach seemed not only reasonable but necessary. Discipline, in Victorian parenting, wasn't cruel in intent. It was practical, moral, and psychological preparation for a world that demanded resilience, obedience, and precision. Every punishment, every expectation, every lesson was a tool to shape a child capable of surviving and even thriving in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of 19th century life. To modern parents, these methods may seem excessive or even brutal, but in context, they were part of a coherent philosophy. A child must be molded early to navigate a world that offered no mercy for the unprepared. And so, as we leave the realm of discipline and move toward the next phase of Victorian childhood, we see that life for a child was structured, guided, and scrutinized at every moment. Obedience was learned, virtue was enforced, and survival depended as much on moral education as on physical endurance. The Victorian child was shaped to be strong, capable, and resilient, though by today's standards, the methods were intense, relentless, and, yes, absolutely illegal. By the time evening rolled around in a Victorian household, the day's lessons in labor, obedience, and moral fortitude weren't over. For children, bedtime was another test entirely, a ritual that combined cramped quarters, questionable hygiene, and a casually dangerous environment, with parental expectations that left little room for comfort or complaint. Modern parents might tuck their children in, read a story, and check that the nightlight works. Victorian children, by contrast, were expected to settle into the night with the same stoicism they had displayed all day, because sleep, like labor and discipline, was both a necessity and a moral obligation. Imagine a typical bedroom, small, dimly lit, shared by multiple siblings or even the entire family in extreme cases. Windows were often tightly closed to conserve heat and keep out drafts, which ironically trapped smoke from the coal fires burning in every room below. Air was thick with the residue of soot, dust, and the faint tang of last night's washing, or lack thereof. Floors creaked ominously, and furniture was heavy and sharp-edged, often placed with little thought to safety. Beds were hard, sometimes elevated on frames that could collapse under even a modestly heavy child. And yet, children were expected to climb in, remain still, and sleep peacefully through the night. Parents rarely lingered with the child. Victorian love was demonstrated through practicality, a blanket arranged just so, the assurance that the bed was clean, the quiet reminder to behave. Affectionate touch was sparse, a soft pat, if anything at all. The philosophy was simple. A child who could sleep obediently and without fuss was a child who was learning self-control. Fussing, fretting, or crying was a moral and practical failure. Parents didn't tolerate prolonged whining. They either corrected the behavior, ignored it, or sent a pointed message that independence and composure were expected, even in a toddler. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, played a significant role in bedtime. Baths were infrequent due to limited access to warm water, and when they did occur, the process was brief and utilitarian. Clothing was often reused multiple times, sometimes with a hastily patched tear or two, because excessive laundry was impractical for families constrained by resources. Linens might be shared, thin, and prone to harboring dust, lice, or bedbugs. Victorian parents didn't obsess over these details. To them, exposure to such discomfort was a normal part of childhood, something that built toughness and resilience. Illnesses, lice infestations, and minor skin infections were considered unfortunate but almost inevitable. The logic was simple. Surviving the night, the week, the year was a measure of strength. Safety hazards were abundant, though rarely acknowledged. Open flames from candles or fireplaces posed a constant threat, especially in cramped rooms cluttered with furniture. Children slept with proximity to these hazards because heating options were limited, and parents prioritized warmth over potential risk. Windows might left open in summer, creating another set of dangers: drafts, insects, or, in rare cases, falls. Floors were hard, beams low, and stairs unguarded. Every night was a minor obstacle course, yet children were expected to navigate it with quiet, disciplined diligence. Bedtime routines, such as they existed, were strictly functional. Stories were brief, often cautionary in nature, intended to instill moral lessons rather than entertain. Children were expected to absorb the warnings, understand the consequences of misbehavior, and internalize the virtues of obedience. These were not whimsical tales for amusement. They were lessons in character and survival, reinforcing what had already been drilled into them during the day. Storytelling doubled as moral reinforcement. The child was reminded that the world was dangerous, life was precarious, and virtue required constant vigilance. Sleep itself was expected to be disciplined. A Victorian child might be awakened in the middle of the night for practical reasons. A sibling needed tending, a fire required stoking, or a parent needed assistance. Quiet endurance was expected. Complaints or resistance were considered a failure of moral development. Children learned early that rest was a duty, not merely a comfort, and that their bodies and minds had to adapt to the irregular rhythms imposed by their family and social environment. Even within the bed, hierarchy mattered. Older children often received slightly more space or comfort, while younger siblings were packed tightly together. Sharing beds was standard, and physical boundaries were minimal. Children quickly learned to tolerate proximity, adjust their posture, and suppress minor irritations. Modern viewers might find this claustrophobic or even traumatic, but to Victorian parents, it was a practical exercise in cooperation and endurance. Learning to coexist, compromise, and remain composed under discomfort was part of preparing for life itself. Nighttime also presented a moral lesson. Darkness was associated with mystery, misbehavior, and in extreme religious households, spiritual peril. Children were taught that nocturnal disobedience, sneaking, whispering, or mischief reflected moral weakness. Supervision was partial, trust was limited, yet parents expected compliance, internalization of rules, and self-regulation without constant monitoring. Essentially, a child had to police themselves, even when parents weren't actively watching, a skill that would serve them in the public sphere and in future employment. Sleep disruptions were common, yet children were encouraged to endure them stoically. Illness, teething, or nightmares were met with practical solutions or corrective attention rather than coddling. Medicine, often homemade or minimally effective, might be administered, but comfort was secondary. Crying was not indulged, whining was met with admonishment. Victorian parents believed that tolerance of discomfort strengthened the child's character. Emotional endurance was considered as crucial as physical survival. Bedtime was, in a sense, a microcosm of life, challenging, uncomfortable, and morally instructive. Affection at night existed, but sparingly and strategically. Parents would occasionally check on a child, adjust blankets, or offer brief words of reassurance, but the underlying expectation remained: self-control, endurance, and compliance. Too much indulgence was feared to encourage weakness. Parents believed that over-softening children would make them ill-prepared for society's hardships. They balanced care with firmness, comfort with discipline, producing children who were resilient in body, mind, and moral understanding. The structure of bedtime also reflected societal priorities. Sleep schedules were influenced by work patterns, household chores, and seasonal changes. Children were often expected to rise early, perform tasks before school or labor, and contribute to the household immediately. The night was simply a pause, a brief interlude between the day's lessons and the next day's challenges. Comfort, entertainment, and leisure were secondary to function, moral development, and survival. In this way, bedtime was both restorative and instructive, a nightly reinforcement of the principles instilled throughout the day. Despite all this, Victorian children often found ways to express themselves within these constraints. Whispered stories, shared warmth with siblings, and quiet imagination provided small pockets of freedom. Yet these moments were fleeting and carefully balanced against the constant expectation of order, obedience, and moral awareness. Parents tolerated them only insofar as they did not undermine the child's capacity to endure, comply, and perform in accordance with societal standards. By the end of childhood evenings, Victorian parents had accomplished several goals. The child had survived the day, internalized lessons in obedience, endured physical and emotional discomfort, and been subtly prepared for the next stage of life. Bedtime was not just rest, it was an extension of the moral and practical training that had dominated the child's existence since birth. Sleep was earned, discipline continued, and character was reinforced even in darkness. As children grew older, the lessons of bedtime, composure, endurance, self-regulation, would translate seamlessly into public life, labor, and education. The skills honed in the quiet of a shared bedroom, under the watchful eye of parents and the silent rules of Victorian morality, were invaluable. Modern comfort, safety, and entertainment were foreign concepts. In the Victorian worldview, resilience was the ultimate gift parents could give their children. And so, as the candle burned low and the coal fire's glow faded to embers, Victorian children lay awake or slept under strict, practical guidance. Nighttime was a test, but it was also a lesson. The world outside would be unforgiving, and the domestic environment served as a rigorous rehearsal for life itself. For parents, bedtime was a tool, a strategy, and an expression of cautious care. For children, it was a lesson in endurance, morality, and preparation for the harsh realities that awaited them beyond the hearth. Victorian childhood, as we've seen, was a relentless combination of labor, obedience, discipline, and endurance. But there was another arena where parents exerted near absolute authority: food. Meals were far more than a source of sustenance. They were lessons in morality, obedience, and societal expectation. Modern parents fret over portion sizes, allergens, and balanced diets. Victorian parents had entirely different priorities: survival, frugality, and moral education through nourishment. To them, a child who complained about food wasn't just picky. They were morally suspect, lazy, or in desperate need of character building. Breakfast was rarely leisurely. Porcelain cups and polished silverware were for the wealthy. Most children ate with whatever was available, sometimes from wooden bowls that had seen better decades. Porridge dominated the table, thick, bland, and often laced with milk that had been skimmed, boiled, or diluted. If a child dared to wrinkle their nose or demand sugar, they were gently, or sometimes not so gently, reminded of the virtues of gratitude and patience. Complaints were interpreted as a lack of discipline. Modern parents might hand a whining toddler a cookie or a juice box. Victorian parents delivered a moral lecture about endurance, humility, and the dangers of indulgence. Lunch, when it existed, followed similar rules. For working-class children, it was often whatever could be packed into a small tin: stale bread, leftover meat, a bit of cheese, maybe an apple if the family was lucky. Schools sometimes provided meals, but these were designed more for efficiency than taste. Students were expected to eat quickly, quietly, and without fuss. Disruptions were met with strict correction, from cold glares to being sent outside to finish in solitude. Eating was a lesson in patience and propriety, an early introduction to a society that valued order over comfort. Dinner was the central meal, both for nutrition and moral instruction. Families often ate together, and every child was expected to follow strict table manners. Forks, knives, and spoons were wielded with precision or risked correction. Children learned that spilling, chewing loudly, or leaving food uneaten were failings of both etiquette and character. Victorian parents monitored behavior closely, interpreting every gesture as evidence of moral fiber or the lack thereof. It was a dinner theater where the stakes were social, emotional, and sometimes spiritual. Proper eating reflected obedience, respect, and preparation for adult life. Nutrition itself was, at times, experimental. Scientific understanding of diet was limited. Milk could be tainted, meat overcooked or poorly stored, and vegetables were often sparse. To compensate, Victorian parents relied on what we might today call superstition or incomplete science. Cod liver oil was considered a cure-all tonic for children, despite its pungent taste. Herbs, teas, and concoctions were administered for strength, health, or moral discipline. Failure to consume these medicinal foods wasn't just disobedience, it was evidence of weakness or poor character. Children quickly learned to endure, swallow, and obey, or face the consequences. Special occasions, such as holidays or birthdays, offered a brief reprieve from the rigid routine. Cakes, sweets, or roasted treats appeared sparingly. But even these moments were carefully controlled. Children were instructed to consume their share with gratitude, to avoid gluttony, and to recognize that indulgence was a privilege earned through obedience and effort. Excess was morally dangerous. Pleasure was acceptable only in moderation and only after demonstrating the proper virtues during the day. The balance of sustenance, enjoyment, and moral instruction was a fine art in the Victorian household. Mealtime was also an arena for hierarchy. Older children received portions first, and their behavior set an example for younger siblings. Respect, patience, and composure were demonstrated and enforced continuously. Complaints, interruptions, or failure to follow rules resulted in both social and practical consequences. Victorian parents didn't just feed bodies. They fed lessons in endurance, morality, and societal expectation. Each meal was an opportunity to mold character, reinforce obedience, and instill habits that would serve children throughout life. Yet, nutrition wasn't purely about survival or morality. Meals reinforced social class, gender roles, and expectations of adulthood. Girls might receive instruction in cooking or careful table presentation, learning domestic skills alongside nourishment. Boys were encouraged to eat heartily, building strength for labor or physical challenges. Each bite was simultaneously sustenance and preparation, designed to meet the rigorous standards of Victorian society. The child's relationship with food became inseparable from their understanding of duty, responsibility, and proper behavior. Food scarcity and poverty complicated matters. Poorer families had limited resources, and children learned early to accept frugality. Complaining about hunger was seen as weakness. Ingenuity, patience, and endurance were praised. Children were often expected to ration their portions, share with siblings, or go without when necessary. Modern parents might panic at such practices, but Victorian households regarded them as essential lessons in resilience. Survival wasn't just about avoiding illness, it was about cultivating moral strength, patience, and discipline under challenging circumstances. Illness, which was common due to poor hygiene and limited medical understanding, intersected with nutrition in complex ways. Parents attempted remedies that combined food and medicine. Soups designed to strengthen, tonics believed to cure weakness, and specific diets prescribed to correct perceived deficiencies. Compliance wasn't optional. A child refusing a remedy or food preparation risked admonishment, repetition, or even physical correction. Obedience extended to every aspect of consumption, reinforcing lessons learned throughout the day. Even snacking, a modern indulgence, was tightly regulated. Sweet treats were rare, and unregulated indulgence was seen as morally dangerous. Victorian children were encouraged to demonstrate patience, temperance, and self-control, even in the face of sugar, a luxury for most families. Lessons about moderation, obedience, and moral vigilance were integrated seamlessly into meals, reinforcing the continuous cycle of education, discipline, and preparation for adulthood. Every aspect of sustenance became an opportunity for character formation. The psychological impact of this approach was significant. Children quickly associated nourishment with obedience, compliance, and moral instruction. Pleasure, when it appeared, was earned. Disobedience led to deprivation, scolding, or discomfort. Victorian parents shaped emotional responses to food as rigorously as they shaped behavior in other areas of life. Endurance, patience, and gratitude became inextricable from basic acts of eating and drinking. To modernize, this might seem harsh or even cruel, but within the context of Victorian society, it was considered practical, moral, and loving. By the end of childhood, meals had done more than sustain. They had instilled a sense of order, taught lessons in morality and patience, reinforced social hierarchy and gender roles, and prepared children for the challenges of adult life. Every spoonful, every ration, every enforced bite contributed to the larger project of Victorian parenting, producing resilient, obedient, morally upright adults capable of navigating a harsh, unforgiving world. Education in the Victorian era was less about curiosity and more about control. To modern parents, a schoolhouse is a place to inspire, to nurture imagination, and to provide a broad foundation of knowledge. To Victorian parents, a schoolhouse was a testing ground for obedience, discipline, and moral fortitude. The curriculum was strict, repetitive, and in many ways unforgiving, designed not to entertain, but to prepare children for the harsh realities of life and for the expectations of a society that valued order, hierarchy, and propriety above all else. Children, often still under 10, were sent to school as early as 6 or 7, sometimes earlier if the family could afford it, or if necessity demanded it. Attendance was rarely optional. The school day was long, often stretching from dawn to dusk, punctuated by only brief breaks. Classrooms were overcrowded, poorly heated in winter, and sometimes unbearably hot in summer. Wooden benches lined the rooms, rigid and uncomfortable, yet children were expected to sit still for hours on end. Movement was not just discouraged, it was punished. A child who fidgeted, whispered, or gazed out of the window risked correction, sometimes public, sometimes painfully private. Victorian teachers wielded authority with absolute seriousness. Corporal punishment was standard. Canes, rulers, and straps were applied swiftly, often for minor infractions that today would earn a gentle warning or a sticker on a chart. A child who mispronounced a word, failed to memorize a lesson, or broke a classroom rule might experience a swift swat, followed by a stern lecture. These punishments weren't arbitrary cruelty. They were believed to instill moral discipline, attention to detail, and respect for authority. Obedience and composure under pressure were essential life skills. The curriculum itself was focused and, by modern standards, narrow. Reading, writing, and arithmetic dominated the day, but the instruction often emphasized rote memorization over critical thinking. History was moralized. Tales of heroes, saints, and cautionary figures were presented as lessons in virtue, obedience, and social duty. Poetry reinforced morality, teaching children proper emotional restraint and societal ideals. Geography and science were occasionally introduced, but only insofar as they reinforced practical knowledge, moral examples, or national pride. Curiosity was allowed only if it remained disciplined, focused, and useful. Religious instruction was omnipresent. Prayer, scripture reading, and moral reflection punctuated every school day. Teachers reinforced the Victorian belief that morality, virtue, and societal order were inseparable from religious observance. Children internalized the idea that obedience wasn't merely a practical necessity, it was a spiritual one. Misbehavior wasn't just disrespectful, it was sinful. The fear of divine disapproval was combined with the immediate, tangible consequences of corporal punishment to shape character with relentless efficiency. Peer dynamics reinforced discipline. Victorian children quickly learned to monitor each other, replicate expected behaviors, and avoid drawing negative attention. Public embarrassment was a constant motivator. A child who fell out of line risked ridicule, punishment, or isolation. These lessons were practical too. Social survival required awareness, restraint, and the ability to conform to hierarchical expectations. Friendships existed, but they were structured around obedience, shared tasks, and collective adherence to rules. Play was permitted only in controlled bursts, often serving as both reward and additional moral training. Girls and boys were educated differently. Girls focused on domestic skills, reading, and moral instruction, often with a heavy emphasis on modesty, propriety, and preparation for marriage or household management. Boys learned reading, writing, numeracy, and practical trades, as well as the virtues of self-reliance, endurance, and obedience. Playtime, even at school, reflected these gendered expectations. Boys might have limited supervised outdoor activities, while girls' games reinforced cooperation, patience, and skill with domestic tasks. Even in play, the moral and practical lessons of Victorian childhood were never far away. School was also where competition and hierarchy were emphasized. Children were graded not just academically, but morally. Good behavior, attentiveness, and neatness were recorded and rewarded. Infractions were noted and punished. Victorian children quickly learned that failure in either realm, behavior or academics, had consequences. Success wasn't simply personal achievement, it reflected family reputation, moral worth, and social standing. Absenteeism, truancy, or lack of progress were taken seriously. Illnesses were tolerated, but not indulgently. Children who lagged behind were corrected, sometimes harshly, to ensure conformity and preparedness for adult life. Victorian parents expected schools to reinforce what was taught at home: obedience, endurance, diligence, and moral rectitude. Education and parenting formed a continuous chain of reinforcement, leaving little space for the undisciplined or the inattentive. Meals at school were similarly structured. Lunchtime was functional and regulated, often a brief, unsupervised period where children were expected to eat what was given without complaint. Sharing, rationing, and patience were practiced, reinforcing lessons of endurance and social cooperation. There was little room for indulgence or preference. Satisfaction came from meeting expectations, not from taste or comfort. Despite the rigor, children often found small ways to assert agency, whispering to friends, passing notes, or daydreaming. Teachers were watchful and missteps were corrected, but these small rebellions demonstrate that even in the strictest systems, human imagination persists. Victorian children were learning obedience, endurance, and social hierarchies, but they were also learning subtle forms of self-expression and social navigation, skills that were vital for life outside the classroom. By the end of the school day, children were physically tired, morally instructed, and socially trained. Lessons from home were reinforced in a public setting. Obedience, endurance, and moral discipline were the core curriculum. Knowledge was secondary to character, and survival, both practical and social, was the ultimate goal. Victorian parents viewed education not as enrichment or self-expression, but as preparation for the harsh realities of life and society's unyielding expectations. As children returned home, they faced chores, moral reflection, and perhaps brief periods of play, but always under supervision and always within a framework of discipline. School wasn't a break from parenting. It was an extension of it, a public arena where moral, social, and intellectual lessons intersected. By the time a child completed even a few years of Victorian schooling, they were conditioned to expect order, punishment for misbehavior, and constant moral instruction. Education in this era was not an opportunity, it was a crucible. It forged obedience, endurance, and awareness of social hierarchies, preparing children for labor, domestic responsibilities, and the relentless moral expectations of Victorian society. Curiosity was permitted only if disciplined. Imagination was allowed only within moral boundaries. And knowledge was valuable only insofar as it prepared children to survive, conform, and succeed in a world that offered neither mercy nor indulgence. Schooling, like labor, discipline, and nutrition, was another strand in the tight web of Victorian childhood. Each element reinforced the others, ensuring that children were constantly monitored, morally educated, and prepared for life's harsh realities. Obedience, endurance, and character formation were the ultimate goals, and every lesson, punishment, and expectation worked toward producing a child capable of navigating the strictures of society. If you think Victorian children had much of a childhood in the modern sense, prepare to be corrected. Play existed, yes, but it wasn't frivolous, indulgent, or purely for fun. Leisure, in the Victorian worldview, was another opportunity to teach moral fortitude, discipline, and practical skills. To modern parents, recess and toys are a break from learning. To Victorian parents, they were carefully monitored exercises in endurance, obedience, and preparation for adult life. Even joy had its rules. Outdoor play, when it occurred, was often brief and utilitarian. Streets, alleys, and courtyards served as playgrounds. But they were also hazards. Traffic, industrial hazards, and the ever-present risk of injury required constant vigilance. Children were expected to navigate these spaces with caution, obey instructions, and avoid attracting undue attention. Running, shouting, or roughhousing was tolerated only in measured doses, often with an emphasis on skill, teamwork, or endurance. A child who misbehaved risked punishment, both public and private, reinforcing lessons learned throughout the day. Toys existed, but they were not indulgences. Dolls for girls, miniature tools for boys, and simple wooden or cloth constructions were common. They weren't meant merely to amuse, they were teaching aids. Girls learned domestic skills, patience, and propriety by dressing and managing dolls, practicing care and responsibility in miniature. Boys mimicked labor with toy tools, practicing precision, observation, and endurance. Every moment of play was an opportunity to instill habits, values, and social expectations. Creativity was permitted only if it served moral or practical instruction. Games were similarly structured. Outdoor activities often involved coordination, endurance, and cooperation. Tag, jump rope, or marbles weren't just about fun. They encouraged teamwork, physical skill, and awareness of rules. Breaking the rules wasn't a minor issue, it was a moral failure. Victorian parents and teachers alike emphasized obedience, even in play, teaching children that all actions had consequences. The logic was simple. A child who could control themselves in games could control themselves in games, could control themselves in labor, social interactions, and life itself. Education and play overlapped frequently. Board games and puzzles were used to sharpen cognitive skills, instill patience, and teach strategic thinking. Lessons in numeracy, logic, and observation were disguised as amusement, reinforcing the constant Victorian philosophy that every activity must contribute to the development of moral and practical competence. Fun, in its purest form, was secondary. Obedience, endurance, and skill came first. Imagination was permitted, but under scrutiny. Storytelling, miniature theater, and creative games were tolerated if they reinforced virtue or morality. Tales of heroism, industriousness, and cautionary adventures were favorites. Children were encouraged to internalize moral lessons, observe social norms, and act in accordance with societal expectations, even in their imaginative play. Unchecked fantasy, rebellion, or indulgence was met with correction, emphasizing that play was never truly free from oversight. Socialization, a natural byproduct of play, was heavily guided. Older children often supervised younger siblings, ensuring games remained orderly, cooperative, and morally instructive. Peer pressure reinforced conformity, teaching children to monitor one another and maintain discipline even in informal settings. This social structuring ensured that Victorian values permeated every aspect of childhood, even moments that might appear unstructured to an outsider. Indoor play was equally controlled. Needlework, drawing, or reading were considered productive leisure activities, honing skills that could be applied in adulthood. Girls might spend hours embroidering, practicing patience, attention to detail, and careful handwork. Boys might study models of machinery or engage in logic puzzles, cultivating observation, problem-solving, and persistence. Even solitary play served a dual purpose: enjoyment and moral practical training. Religious instruction often filtered into play. Hymn practice, moral games, and storytelling reinforced spiritual principles alongside physical and cognitive skills. Children learned that virtue, obedience, and morality were inescapable, even in leisure. Moments of joy were never divorced from instruction. They were an extension of the day's lessons. Pleasure was earned, structured, and purposeful. Victorian parents also believed that exposure to mild discomfort during play built resilience. Cold weather, wet conditions, and physical challenges were not avoided. They were embraced as opportunities to strengthen character. Children were taught to endure discomfort with stoicism, to cooperate under challenging circumstances, and to value perseverance over immediate gratification. The modern emphasis on safety and comfort was largely absent. Resilience was paramount. Competition reinforced these lessons. Games were rarely casual. Winners and losers were clearly defined, and behavior was closely monitored. Cheating, whining, or giving up prematurely was met with moral instruction or correction. Children learned to accept defeat gracefully, persevere despite frustration, and regulate their emotions, skills that mirrored the expectations of labor, schooling, and social conduct. The psychological impact of these practices was profound. Play, far from being a carefree escape, became another arena for moral, social, and practical training. Children internalized lessons in patience, cooperation, endurance, and discipline. They learned to navigate social hierarchies, manage conflict, and regulate their impulses. Modern observers might see play as oppressive. Victorian parents saw it as essential preparation for the adult world. Even festive occasions, such as holidays or birthdays, followed similar principles. Games and celebrations were structured, brief, and often tied to moral instruction or social hierarchy. Indulgence was controlled. Excitement was contained. Children were expected to demonstrate gratitude, moderation, and composure, reinforcing lessons learned daily. Joy was permitted, but never uncontrolled or excessive. Ultimately, Victorian play and leisure were inseparable from the broader system of parenting. Labor, discipline, nutrition, and education all intersected with recreation, creating a continuous framework of moral and practical instruction. Children were constantly observed, corrected, and guided, ensuring that even their most spontaneous moments contributed to character formation. Every game, every puzzle, every doll or tool was a vehicle for teaching resilience, obedience, and social awareness. By the end of childhood, these practices produced remarkable endurance and adaptability. Victorian children learned to navigate social structures, regulate their behavior, and tolerate discomfort. They developed physical strength, cognitive skills, and moral awareness. And yet, modern viewers might cringe at the intensity and relentlessness of these lessons. Play was never merely play. It was training for survival in a world that valued conformity, endurance, and virtue above all else. If Victorian childhood was a crucible of discipline, labor, and moral instruction, health and hygiene were its most unpredictable elements. Modern parents obsess over hand sanitizer, balanced diets, and doctor's visits. Victorian parents? They faced a world where disease, poor sanitation, and limited medical knowledge loomed constantly, yet they approached it with a mix of practicality, superstition, and moral instruction. Illness wasn't simply unfortunate. It was a test of endurance, compliance, and character. Surviving it, or failing to, reflected a child's moral as well as physical fortitude. First, let's set the scene. Water sources were often contaminated. Rivers, wells, and even cisterns teemed with bacteria and industrial runoff. Cities were packed with smog, soot, and human waste, all contributing to an environment rife with infection. Victorian homes lacked indoor plumbing in most cases, and bathrooms as we know them were rare. Chamber pots were common, emptied into the streets or gutters, creating hazards and odors. Soap existed but was expensive, and washing was infrequent. Children, for all their labor and obedience, were constantly exposed to germs without modern defenses. Parents managed these risks with practicality rather than perfection. Hygiene was enforced when possible, but always balanced against resources and social expectations. Baths were scheduled rarely, often once a week or less, and children learned to tolerate the discomfort of cold water, harsh scrubbing, and quick rinses. Clothing, often hand-me-downs, was reused and patched repeatedly. Children were expected to endure the smells, textures, and irritations of repeated wear, internalizing patience and stoicism in the process. Cleanliness, like many other aspects of Victorian life, was less about comfort and more about moral and practical lessons. Illnesses were frequent and dangerous. Measles, scarlet fever, tuberculosis, and smallpox were common. Treatment was rudimentary. Doctors were expensive and inaccessible to many, and when consulted, their methods ranged from herbal concoctions to bleeding or purging. Victorian parents relied heavily on home remedies, some practical, some bordering on superstition. A child with a fever might be given a warm compress, a spoonful of honey, or a dose of rhubarb. Compliance was expected. A child who resisted medicine or ignored instructions risked moral reprimand alongside their own discomfort. Endurance, obedience, and patience were inseparable from survival. Nutrition, which we discussed earlier, intersected here. Illness was managed partly through diet, broths, teas, and porridges designed to strengthen the child. Overfeeding or indulgence was frowned upon. Moderation was a moral principle as much as a medical one. Victorian parents believed that children who could endure bland, repetitive meals were better equipped to survive sickness, poverty, and the unpredictability of life. Complaints about taste, texture, or quantity were considered evidence of moral weakness. Physical resilience was cultivated early. Children were encouraged to play outdoors, even in adverse conditions, to strengthen their constitution. Cold, wet, and muddy conditions were tolerated and often celebrated as opportunities for fortitude. Illnesses were framed as challenges rather than crises. The ability to endure them reflected the child's character. Weakness, whining, or overt distress was socially and morally discouraged. Endurance wasn't optional, it was essential. Sleeping arrangements, which we explored in the previous chapter, compounded these challenges. Shared beds, poor ventilation, and damp conditions increased susceptibility to disease. Yet Victorian parents emphasized discipline even in these circumstances. Children were expected to sleep quietly, tolerate discomfort, and regulate their own bodies. Crying or complaining at night wasn't just annoying, it was evidence that a child lacked moral or physical resilience. Nighttime became a continuation of the day's moral and practical education, reinforcing lessons in self-control, patience, and endurance. In addition to personal hygiene, public health was a concern parents could influence only indirectly. Families living near industrial areas faced smoke, soot, and polluted water. Streets were crowded, unsanitary, and dangerous, yet children were expected to navigate them with caution and propriety. Awareness, attentiveness, and self-discipline were part of health education, even if invisible to modern eyes. Every encounter with dirt, disease, or hazard was an opportunity for character development. Medical interventions were minimal, and when they occurred, often brutal by today's standards. Quarantines, herbal treatments, leeches, and purges were common. Compliance with treatment was enforced, and resistance could lead to both punishment and moral condemnation. Victorian parents emphasized that obedience was intertwined with survival. A child who endured unpleasant treatments was both physically protected and morally strengthened. Fear of illness, discipline, and social judgment created a complex web in which morality, endurance, and health intersected. Vaccinations existed, but were controversial. Smallpox inoculations were available, but sometimes dangerous or unpopular. Parents faced the challenge of balancing risk, moral obligation, and societal pressure. Children often internalized a sense of duty alongside fear. Compliance wasn't optional, and moral worth was tied to behavior, even in health matters. A sick child was not merely ill. They were a test case in obedience, endurance, and character. Disease, poor nutrition, and environmental hazards meant that mortality rates for children were high. Victorian parents knew this, yet their response was often stoic rather than indulgent. Preparation for survival was constant. Lessons in hygiene, endurance, and compliance were woven into every aspect of life. The goal was clear: raise children capable of enduring illness, navigating hazards, and meeting societal expectations with composure. Emotional indulgence was considered dangerous. Stoicism and practical skill were paramount. Psychologically, this environment produced remarkable resilience, but also constant pressure. Children learned that discomfort, illness, and danger were inevitable, and that proper behavior in the face of adversity was expected. Fear, endurance, and moral instruction were inseparable. Lessons in hygiene and health were also lessons in obedience, patience, and self-regulation. Modern parents might struggle to comprehend such relentless expectation, but in context, it was consistent with a broader philosophy of Victorian parenting: survival, moral fortitude, and preparation for life's harsh realities were paramount. By adolescence, a Victorian child had internalized a complex system. Labor, discipline, nutrition, schooling, play, and hygiene were all interlinked. Every challenge, every discomfort, every illness was not simply endured. It was an opportunity to learn moral, physical, and social lessons. Health was both practical and moral, a reflection of character and a determinant of survival. Victorian parenting was unrelenting in its logic. Prepare children for a dangerous world and teach them that endurance, obedience, and moral fortitude are inseparable from physical survival. In this environment, even trivial injuries or minor ailments became character-building exercises. Scrapes, bruises, colds, and fevers were met with discipline, care, and moral instruction. Complaints were minimized, fortitude was praised, and endurance was normalized. Children emerged hardened, capable, and accustomed to adversity, but always under the unyielding watch of authority. By the time a Victorian child reached social awareness, the lessons of home, school, and play had been firmly drilled into their bones. But life was not yet done shaping them. In Victorian society, manners and social conduct were more than etiquette. They were moral training, survival skills, and a reflection of the family's status. A slip of the tongue, a misstep at the table, or a poorly executed curtsy could mark a child as deficient, lazy, or morally suspect. Socialization was rigorous, relentless, and often merciless. Manners began early, as soon as a child could mimic adult behavior. From toddlers up, obedience and propriety were enforced through constant observation and correction. Saying please and thank you wasn't optional. It was evidence of moral upbringing. Speaking out of turn, whining, or expressing annoyance in front of adults was considered a moral failing as much as a breach of etiquette. Victorian parents believed that early correction of minor infractions would prevent major social disasters later. Every gesture, glance, and word was scrutinized. Mealtime, previously a lesson in nutrition and obedience, doubled as a social training ground. Children learned to handle cutlery correctly, chew quietly, and converse politely. Even the arrangement of dishes and the order in which food was eaten conveyed lessons in discipline and respect. Boys and girls were taught subtly different expectations. Girls for domestic refinement and social grace, boys for composure, assertiveness, and future professional or public life. Failing to meet these standards could result in a stern lecture, embarrassment, or corporal correction. Formal introductions and social interactions were rehearsed. Children learned how to bow, curtsy, and make eye contact, or avoid it, in ways deemed appropriate. Social observance was exacting. Gestures, posture, tone of voice, and timing were all scrutinized. Parents drilled these skills relentlessly. A missed cue wasn't just awkward. It was a moral failing, evidence that the child needed more instruction, correction, or supervision. Victorian society demanded that a child present themselves flawlessly, and parents assumed responsibility for ensuring it happened. Friendships, too, were filtered through social expectations. Children were taught whom they could associate with and how to conduct themselves in peer settings. Rough play, or overly boisterous behavior, was discouraged in formal settings, as was openly questioning authority. Respect for elders, adherence to hierarchy, and awareness of social norms were instilled from a young age. Peer groups became another arena for instruction. Children learned to correct each other, reinforce hierarchy, and navigate social consequences. Public behavior reinforced lessons in morality and endurance. Walking through streets, visiting markets, or attending church required poise, attentiveness, and obedience. Parents used subtle observation and correction to shape comportment. Trips outside the home were not for pleasure. They were exercises in vigilance, decorum, and moral reflection. Children learned to endure fatigue, adhere to rules, and maintain composure under scrutiny. A lapse in behavior could result in public embarrassment, moral instruction, or physical correction. The Victorian emphasis on gender roles became particularly pronounced in socialization. Girls were trained to exhibit modesty, refinement, and nurturing qualities. Their speech, posture, and appearance were continuously evaluated. Boys were encouraged to develop assertiveness, physical endurance, and social confidence. Mistakes in gendered behavior were interpreted as moral or character flaws, and correction was swift and often sharp. Parents assumed that early reinforcement would produce adults capable of navigating their expected social spheres with grace and authority. Religious instruction intertwined seamlessly with socialization. Manners were moralized. Respect, obedience, and propriety were virtues sanctioned by divine expectation. Disobedience, rudeness, or lack of composure could be framed as a spiritual failing. Moral and social education were inseparable. Victorian children internalized the idea that good conduct pleased both society and God. Spiritual reflection reinforced behavioral compliance, embedding morality into every social interaction. Observation played a critical role. Parents constantly monitored children's gestures, speech, and posture, correcting them immediately or indirectly through admonishment or shame. Children learned that every action had social consequences and that self-control was essential. Peer enforcement also reinforced behavior. Children quickly became adept at policing themselves and each other, understanding that social grace, moral propriety, and obedience were not merely parental expectations, they were necessary for acceptance and survival. Even small moments, like greeting a visitor or attending a church service, were laden with instruction. Children were reminded to speak softly, sit upright, and display proper attentiveness. Fidgeting, whispering, or showing impatience could result in moral lessons that ranged from subtle reprimands to public correction. Victorian parents treated these incidents as opportunities to instill patience, self-control, and moral awareness. Every social interaction was a chance to reinforce discipline. Play, previously tolerated for skill and endurance, was also guided by social expectation. Cooperative games reinforced fairness, adherence to rules, and hierarchy. Competitive games taught self-control, patience, and grace in both victory and defeat. Imaginative play was encouraged only insofar as it reinforced moral lessons, obedience, or social skill. Even joy and leisure were subordinated to the overarching goal of molding socially competent, morally upright, and resilient adults. By adolescence, children had internalized an intricate web of social expectations. Manners, hierarchy, and moral awareness were second nature. Compliance wasn't optional, it was internalized. Children instinctively knew how to behave in public, navigate social hierarchies, and present themselves correctly. They had learned to endure discomfort, conceal minor frustrations, and respond to correction with composure. Victorian socialization was relentless, but effective. It produced individuals who could navigate the rigid expectations of society with remarkable precision. Yet, the intensity of this training had psychological costs. Constant scrutiny, correction, and moralization could suppress spontaneity, exaggerate anxiety about social approval, and create a fear of error. Victorian children grew up aware that misbehavior, however minor, had consequences, not just in punishment, but in shame, spiritual disapproval, and social judgment. Emotional restraint, composure, and conformity were paramount. Individuality and whimsy were carefully moderated. In sum, Victorian socialization was a continuous, overlapping process. It reinforced lessons from home, school, play, nutrition, health, and hygiene, producing children who were observant, disciplined, and socially skilled. Every interaction, gesture, and word became part of the moral and practical curriculum. Obedience, composure, and resilience were the ultimate goals. Pleasure, indulgence, or spontaneity were secondary or carefully constrained. The child's world was a series of overlapping tests, each designed to cultivate endurance, moral fortitude, and social competence. Victorian childhood, rigorous in school, home, play, and socialization, reached a new intensity with the introduction of labor. Work was not merely a practical necessity, it was a moral lesson, a shaping force, and a preparation for adult life. To modern eyes, expecting a child to work long hours in factories, as apprentices, or in domestic service might seem cruel or exploitative. To Victorian parents, it was a test of endurance, obedience, and character. the ultimate continuation of lessons learned since birth. Labor began early, often before the age of 10. For working-class families, children were essential contributors to household income. Even in middle-class households, boys and girls were expected to assist with chores that taught discipline, self-reliance, and practical skill. The logic was straightforward. A child who could endure physical exertion, obey orders, and complete tasks efficiently was morally and practically prepared for life. Complaints or hesitation were treated as moral failings, not mere discomfort. Factories were grim schools of endurance. Children as young as 6 or 7 could be found tending machinery, cleaning workspaces, or assisting adults in dangerous environments. Workdays stretched from dawn to dusk, punctuated by brief meals and minimal rest. The industrial environment was hot, loud, and hazardous. Spinning machinery, exposed belts, and coal dust created a constant risk of injury. Compliance was not optional. Workers, regardless of age, were expected to follow instructions precisely. Mistakes could result in immediate injury or corporal punishment, teaching children to respect authority and anticipate danger simultaneously. Apprenticeships provided a more structured introduction to labor, blending skill development with moral training. Boys learned trades such as carpentry, blacksmithing, or tailoring, while girls were often trained in domestic service, embroidery, or household management. Apprentices were expected to obey their masters without question, endure long hours, and internalize lessons in skill, discipline, and hierarchy. Praise was rare. Correction, including physical punishment, was common. The apprentice who learned to comply, endure, and persist became not just skilled, but morally fortified. Domestic labor mirrored this pattern. Middle-class children might assist with cooking, cleaning, or managing siblings, while upper-class children observed and practiced oversight. Even play was framed as preparation. Setting the table, arranging books, or maintaining personal belongings were exercises in responsibility, endurance, and moral awareness. Victorian parents instilled the lesson that labor, in all forms, was both practical and moral, reinforcing the idea that effort, obedience, and resilience were inseparable virtues. Work reinforced hierarchy. Older children supervised younger ones, mirroring the hierarchical structure of adult workplaces. They learned responsibility, leadership, and the burden of authority, tempered by obedience to those above. Mistakes, or laziness, were corrected not only by parents, but by parents and supervisors, creating a constant feedback loop in which moral, social, and practical lessons overlapped. The child who mastered these dynamics was prepared to navigate the adult world efficiently and resiliently. Even in labor, the moral dimension was clear. Endurance under discomfort, obedience to authority, and diligence were praised, while resistance, laziness, or complaint was punished. Physical hardship was understood as a teacher. It cultivated strength, patience, and moral fortitude. Victorian parents believed that children who avoided discomfort or shirked responsibility would struggle morally and practically in adulthood. Lessons learned in labor were not only practical, but fundamental to character formation. Education and labor intersected. Apprenticeship or factory work reinforced lessons in numeracy, literacy, and observation. Tasks required calculation, careful measurement, and memorization. Work was intellectually demanding as well as physically taxing. Mistakes were not simply corrected, they were moralized. A child who failed to calculate properly or operate a machine safely was not only incompetent but morally deficient, emphasizing the Victorian belief that diligence and obedience were inseparable from virtue. Labor also extended to moral and domestic training. Children were taught to anticipate needs, manage resources efficiently, and care for others while maintaining discipline and self-control. These skills were essential for future adulthood, whether in the household, the marketplace, or broader society. Every task, however menial, became an opportunity for moral and practical instruction. Modern observers might see tedium or exploitation. Victorian parents saw education, endurance, and preparation. Hazards were omnipresent. Industrial accidents, household injuries, and exposure to environmental dangers taught vigilance and resilience. Children learned to navigate risk with care and composure. Complaints or fear were discouraged, reinforcing the lesson that life was inherently challenging and required moral and physical stamina. Survival, both literal and social, depended on the ability to endure discomfort without complaint and perform duties with precision. Labor reinforced socialization and hierarchy. Children learned the importance of teamwork, deference to authority, and the consequences of failure. Observing adult behavior, assisting in tasks, and receiving correction created a continuous feedback loop that intertwined obedience, social skill, and practical competence. Mistakes were opportunities for instruction. Success demonstrated character, resilience, and moral worth. Even leisure was subordinated to labor's lessons. Free time was limited and often used to reinforce discipline. Reading, sewing, or practicing skills during rest periods combined education with moral training. Children internalized the idea that every moment could serve practical or moral ends. Idleness was discouraged. Endurance, diligence, and obedience were paramount. By adolescence, Victorian children had internalized a complex system. Home, school, play, hygiene, socialization, and now labor were all interconnected. They had learned to endure physical hardship, obey authority, and perform tasks efficiently while maintaining moral awareness. The lessons of childhood converged in labor. Practical skill, resilience, and obedience were inseparable, producing individuals capable of surviving and thriving within Victorian society's rigid expectations. The psychological impact of this system was profound. Children developed remarkable endurance, self-regulation, and practical competence, but at the cost of emotional freedom and spontaneity. Fear of failure, authority, and moral reprimand was constant. Modern parents might see cruelty or excessive control. Victorian parents saw preparation, resilience, and moral education. Work was a crucible, forging both body and character, shaping children for the relentless expectations of adult life. By the time children entered adolescence, Victorian parenting had escalated its intensity. The lessons of home, school, play, hygiene, socialization, and labor now intersected with a heightened focus on punishment and discipline. Modern parents might cringe at what was considered normal correction in this era, but Victorian adults saw these measures as essential to shaping morally upright, obedient, and resilient adults. Misbehavior, disobedience, or weakness was met not only with correction, but with moral instruction, a seamless blending of fear, endurance, and internalized responsibility. Discipline was omnipresent. It wasn't limited to occasional scoldings. It was a continuous, structured system, a web of consequences that shaped every action, word, and thought. Victorian parents believed that the adolescent mind was particularly malleable, capable of understanding the gravity of moral instruction while still developing the physical and emotional endurance necessary for adulthood. Thus, punishment intensified, becoming more strategic, targeted, and psychologically nuanced. Corporal punishment was common, though administered with varying degrees of severity depending on social class, household norms, and the perceived severity of misbehavior. Canes, straps, and rulers were standard tools. Mistakes, failures, or disobedience were corrected swiftly and publicly when possible, maximizing the impact of shame alongside physical discomfort. The logic was clear. Immediate correction reinforced moral awareness, obedience, and the consequences of action, or inaction. Modern sensibilities might see this as harsh, but in Victorian eyes, it was both necessary and loving. Punishment extended beyond the physical. Adolescents experienced social and emotional discipline designed to internalize control and propriety. Isolation, verbal reprimand, and moral lectures reinforced the idea that misbehavior was unacceptable. Children were expected to reflect, internalize lessons, and exhibit improved behavior immediately. Complaining, arguing, or showing resentment was discouraged and considered further evidence of moral weakness. Stoicism and self-regulation were the ultimate goals. Education and labor also became sites of intensified discipline. Adolescents were expected to meet higher academic standards and complete more demanding work tasks. Failure to comply was interpreted as both a practical and moral deficiency. Teachers, employers, and parents all reinforced this system. Adolescents learned that errors were not simply mistakes, they were lapses in moral and practical competence that required correction and reflection. Success was rewarded subtly. Approval, praise, or increased responsibility signaled moral and practical growth. Social conduct remained a critical domain for punishment and correction. Adolescents were judged by their comportment, speech, and interactions with peers and adults alike. Missteps were corrected publicly or privately, reinforcing lessons in hierarchy, obedience, and moral propriety. Victorian parents and educators assumed that public embarrassment could be a powerful teacher, producing enduring self-awareness and improved behavior. Every social interaction was thus another test of endurance, composure, and moral vigilance. Reinforcement was continuous. Parents employed subtle and indirect methods alongside overt punishment. Praise, attention, or rewards were contingent on compliance, while minor transgressions could elicit withdrawal of affection or privilege. Adolescents quickly internalized the idea that behavior, obedience, and endurance directly influenced outcomes, both socially and emotionally. Modern observers might see this as manipulation, but Victorian parents viewed it as essential moral and practical education. Religion intersected heavily with punishment. Misbehavior was framed not only as social or practical failure, but as moral and spiritual deficiency. Confession, reflection, and prayer were tools to reinforce compliance and cultivate moral awareness. Adolescents were taught that God observed behavior as closely as parents did, reinforcing the expectation of constant moral vigilance.
This combination of spiritual and practical correction ensured that obedience and endurance were deeply internalized. Labor also intensified during adolescence, reinforcing lessons in discipline and endurance. Apprenticeships became more demanding, factory work more challenging, and domestic responsibilities more complex. Failure to meet expectations was met with correction, physical or verbal. Adolescents learned that resilience, diligence, and moral integrity were inseparable from practical competence. Mistakes were rarely excused. They were interpreted as signs of character weakness requiring remediation. Psychologically, the system produced both resilience and anxiety. Adolescents developed remarkable self-control, adaptability, and awareness of social and moral norms. At the same time, fear of failure, punishment, or moral deficiency was pervasive. Victorian children learned to navigate authority, endure discomfort, and internalize moral standards as they matured. Independence was permitted only within boundaries of obedience and propriety. Freedom, in its modern sense, was constrained by continuous moral and practical expectation. Peer observation amplified discipline. Adolescents monitored each other, corrected lapses, and reinforced social and moral hierarchies. Public behavior became a performance, evaluated constantly by peers and adults alike. Adolescents learned early that social missteps could result in shame, correction, or exclusion. Endurance, composure, and obedience were not only practical necessities, they were critical for social survival. Victorian parents also recognized the heightened emotional sensitivity of adolescence. Punishment was designed to cultivate maturity, self-reflection, and moral fortitude, often using subtle psychological pressure. Withdrawal of affection, moral lectures, and structured tasks encouraged introspection and correction. Adolescents learned to regulate emotional responses, anticipate consequences, and maintain composure under scrutiny. Emotional restraint was a cornerstone of character formation. Even leisure and recreation were subjected to intensified discipline. Play, reading, or hobbies were permissible only if they reinforced moral and practical education. Idle indulgence, excessive fantasy, or deviation from prescribed behavior was discouraged. Adolescents learned that every action, however small, had moral and practical significance. Compliance was rewarded, misbehavior corrected, and endurance in discomfort continually reinforced. By the end of adolescence, Victorian children were fully immersed in a continuous, overlapping system of instruction. Punishment and discipline had shaped their moral, practical, social, and emotional development. Obedience, endurance, composure, and moral fortitude were internalized. Mistakes were interpreted as opportunities for correction and reflection, and resilience became second nature. Modern observers might see oppression or excessive control. Victorian parents saw preparation for the harsh realities of adult life. Adolescence marked the culmination of Victorian childhood, a period where labor, education, play, hygiene, socialization, and discipline converge to produce young adults capable of surviving, functioning, and morally thriving in society. Mistakes were corrected, endurance tested, and obedience enforced, producing a generation conditioned to meet society's strict expectations. Adolescence was the bridge, but marriage and gender expectations were the threshold into full Victorian adulthood. By this stage, the relentless training of childhood, Obedience, endurance, moral instruction, labor, hygiene, socialization, and discipline culminated in a societal contract that demanded conformity to gendered roles. Modern parents might imagine this stage as a slow adjustment to independence, but in Victorian times, it was more a transfer of responsibility, authority, and moral expectation from parents to the society at large. For girls, preparation for marriage was central. Domestic training, social etiquette, and moral rectitude were their primary education. Girls were instructed in cooking, cleaning, sewing, embroidery, and household management, not merely as hobbies, but as practical skills for sustaining a home. Play and chores had reinforced these abilities, creating muscle memory, patience, and endurance. Lessons in kindness, modesty, and virtue were never abstract. They were expected to manifest in every social interaction, especially with future suitors and within the domestic sphere. Girls' socialization emphasized observation and subtle influence. They were taught to manage relationships, interpret social cues, and maintain composure regardless of discomfort or insult. Emotional restraint was a moral and social imperative. A young woman's value, according to Victorian norms, was inseparable from her obedience, appearance, skill, and ability to navigate complex social hierarchies. Failures in these areas were interpreted as moral lapses, evidence of poor upbringing, or signs of character weakness. Courtship itself was tightly controlled. Young women rarely approached suitors. Interactions were highly supervised, limited, and ritualized. Conversation, gestures, and behavior were constantly monitored, ensuring compliance with expected modesty and propriety. Public outings and social gatherings became tests of composure, patience, and moral awareness. A misstep could have lasting repercussions, damaging reputation and marriage prospects. Victorian parenting, by this stage, had trained girls to endure scrutiny, internalize rules, and perform obedience flawlessly. Boys were subject to parallel, though gendered, pressures. Labor and apprenticeship had trained them in endurance, skill, and obedience to authority. Education reinforced literacy, numeracy, and practical knowledge. Socialization taught hierarchy, assertiveness, and respect for propriety. As marriage approached, young men were expected to demonstrate stability, responsibility, and moral rectitude. Courtship was a demonstration of both social awareness and self-control, with success defined not by charm alone, but by the ability to navigate rules, hierarchy, and moral expectations. Family expectations were critical. Parents continued to exert influence, framing marriage as both a moral duty and a practical arrangement. Girls were taught that their conduct reflected family honor. Boys were reminded that their success, labor, and social behavior would affect family standing. Obedience, endurance, and moral fortitude remained central, but the stakes were higher. Errors could have lasting social, economic, and emotional consequences. Work and domestic responsibility intertwined with gender roles. Girls entering married life were expected to manage households efficiently, raising children, maintaining social obligations, and exercising moral guidance over the next generation. Boys, as future heads of households or laborers, were expected to provide, protect, and uphold social and moral order. Every lesson of childhood, discipline, labor, hygiene, social skill, endurance, and obedience was now applied to adult life, reinforcing the cumulative training of Victorian upbringing. Sexual morality, tightly intertwined with marriage expectations, was a domain of intense instruction. Girls were taught modesty, restraint, and propriety. Boys were instructed in self-control, honor, and the avoidance of immoral behavior.
Education, play, labor, and socialization had all subtly reinforced these lessons. Missteps were interpreted as moral failings with lasting consequences, ensuring that compliance, restraint, and endurance were internalized before entering adult life. Economic preparation was equally important. Apprenticeships, labor, and household management all trained adolescents to navigate scarcity, maximize resources, and maintain endurance under pressure.
Marriage required practical skill, budgeting, resource allocation, and efficient domestic management. Victorian parenting emphasized that a well-managed household, successful apprenticeship, or prosperous labor career was both a reflection of moral fortitude and a practical necessity for survival and respectability. Social hierarchy remained paramount. Marriage was often a contract as much as a union of affection. Family reputation, social standing, and community perception guided choices, behaviors, and expectations. Victorian children, now young adults, were expected to internalize these pressures and navigate them seamlessly. Mistakes were not merely personal, they reflected family honor, moral upbringing, and adherence to societal rules. Obedience, composure, and endurance remained essential. Emotional endurance, learned through decades of training, reached its pinnacle. Young adults were expected to navigate disappointment, manage social pressure, and perform their duties with composure. Personal desire was often secondary to expectation, reflecting the Victorian belief that moral and social responsibility outweighed individual indulgence. Adolescents who had mastered these lessons were more likely to succeed in marriage and adult society, while those who faltered risked lifelong social and emotional consequences. Education and leisure intersected with marriage preparation as well. Girls refined social skills, musical ability, and household arts. Boys polished literacy, practical knowledge, and social awareness. Hobbies, lessons, and accomplishments were not indulgences. They were tests of composure, endurance, and skill. Participation demonstrated moral training, social readiness, and internalized obedience. Victorian parents monitored progress, corrected lapses, and ensured compliance until the child was capable of adult-level responsibility. Religious and moral instruction remained constant. Marriage was framed as both a spiritual duty and a practical arrangement. Young adults were expected to navigate moral challenges with restraint, endurance, and composure. Parents reinforced these lessons through counsel, supervision, and moral guidance, ensuring that obedience, diligence, and endurance remained central even as children approached independence. By the end of adolescence and the threshold of marriage, Victorian children had been molded through decades of intense oversight. Labor, discipline, education, hygiene, play, socialization, and moral instruction converged into a framework that demanded obedience, resilience, composure, and moral awareness. Young men and women entered adulthood armed with practical skill, social awareness, and a deeply internalized sense of duty, capable of surviving, thriving, and upholding the moral and social expectations of Victorian society. Yet, beneath the surface, modern observers might note the costs: restrained emotion, suppressed individuality, and constant anxiety over compliance. Victorian parenting, unyielding in its philosophy, produced adults prepared for survival and success, but at the expense of freedom, spontaneity, and the carefree aspects of childhood we take for granted today. The culmination of these expectations in marriage was both the reward and the ultimate test of decades of preparation. Adulthood in Victorian society often arrived with little fanfare, yet it carried the cumulative weight of decades of preparation. Childhood, adolescence, labor, discipline, and socialization all coalesced into a framework designed to produce adults who could survive, endure, and uphold the rigid moral and social codes of the era. And yet, as many Victorians would discover, reflection on one's upbringing was rarely simple. Memories of play, schooling, labor, punishment, and instruction were often tinged with a mix of pride, nostalgia, and the faint sting of endured discomfort, a curious combination that modern perspectives might struggle to parse. Reflection began with the realization of endurance. Adults remembered childhood as a series of challenges, small and large, that demanded obedience, fortitude, and moral compliance. Cold baths, long hours of chores, strict schooling, labor in workshops or factories, and intense social instruction all stood out. For some, these memories were tinged with pride. They had survived and, more importantly, internalized the lessons of resilience, diligence, and composure. Childhood was remembered as a crucible, shaping character through discomfort, observation, and rigorous expectation. Yet nostalgia was rarely uncomplicated. Many Victorians recalled the sting of correction, the embarrassment of public reprimand, and the relentless observation of parents and teachers. Adolescents remembered being constantly scrutinized, every gesture, word, or misstep subject to moral judgment. Discipline, though effective, often lingered in memory as both formative and oppressive. The duality was unmistakable. Enduring hardship produced strength, yet it also left a lingering awareness of authority, control, and the costs of obedience. Play was remembered differently in adulthood. Victorians recalled games, sports, and imaginative activities, yet rarely as pure joy. Even in the rare moments of carefree play, they recognized the lessons embedded: endurance, skill, social hierarchy, and moral rectitude. Dolls, toys, and puzzles were never frivolous. They were instruments of training, reinforcing patience, precision, and social awareness. Outdoor games were tests of physical resilience and compliance with rules, subtly preparing children for the adult world. Reflection on play revealed a carefully structured childhood in which even leisure was inseparable from moral and practical instruction. Education and labor, pillars of Victorian childhood, carried particular weight in memory. Adults remembered apprenticeships, factory work, domestic chores, and academic instruction as both grueling and formative. Mistakes, punishments, and corrections were recalled not simply as hardships, but as defining moments of moral and practical growth. Reading, arithmetic, and practical skill acquisition were never optional. They were the instruments by which resilience, obedience, and competence were instilled. Success was celebrated subtly, but failure was etched deeply into memory, reinforcing the Victorian lesson that life's challenges demanded endurance. Health and hygiene were remembered with a blend of humor and horror. Cold baths, rare cleanliness, and exposure to disease were seen as both a trial and a necessary preparation. Adults recalled fevers, scrapes, bruises, and the occasional serious illness as events that demanded compliance and endurance. Modern readers might see neglect or cruelty, but Victorian reflection framed these experiences as formative, evidence of character tested and strengthened by adversity. Even minor ailments were recalled as moral lessons: patience, compliance, and fortitude in the face of discomfort. Socialization and manners emerged as particularly memorable aspects of upbringing. Adults reflected on the relentless instruction in conduct, propriety, and hierarchy. Conversations, gestures, posture, and speech had been monitored constantly, shaping both social awareness and moral sensibility. Adolescents remembered public interactions, courtship rituals, and social gatherings as exercises in endurance, observation, and internalized obedience. Even as adults, the lessons endured. Composure, attentiveness, and careful observation became deeply ingrained traits, carried from childhood into professional, domestic, and social life. Gender expectations and marriage preparation were often recollected with a mix of pride and exasperation. Women remembered domestic training, social etiquette, and moral instruction as both necessary and restrictive. Men recalled apprenticeships, labor, and social training as preparation for responsibility, authority, and survival. Both genders recognize the cumulative impact of years of instruction: competence, endurance, moral awareness, and social skill. And yet, reflection often carried a subtle awareness of the costs: suppressed spontaneity, constrained emotion, and the ever-present shadow of scrutiny. Punishment and discipline, ubiquitous throughout childhood and adolescence, were remembered with complexity. Adults recalled fear, pain, embarrassment, and correction as constant companions. Yet they also recognized the effectiveness. Obedience, composure, and moral awareness had been thoroughly instilled. Reflection revealed the dual nature of Victorian discipline: harsh, unrelenting, yet undeniably formative. The lessons endured, shaping personal behavior, social interactions, and moral judgment well into adulthood. Adulthood also highlighted the interconnectedness of all prior lessons. Work, play, hygiene, socialization, labor, discipline, and moral instruction had not been isolated events. They formed a continuous system. Adults reflected on how each experience built upon the previous. Endurance, cultivated in childhood, prepared for labor. Socialization reinforced composure under observation. Moral instruction guided behavior in domestic and professional spheres. The Victorian upbringing, when viewed in its entirety, appeared as a carefully orchestrated progression from dependence to responsibility, from observation to internalized moral and social competence. Yet reflection was not always approving. Some adults recognized the psychological toll. Anxiety, fear of failure, and suppressed individuality were common. The relentless expectations of obedience, composure, and endurance could weigh heavily, leaving a sense of missed spontaneity and emotional freedom. And yet, even in critique, many acknowledged the effectiveness. Victorian parenting produced adults capable of navigating a complex, demanding society, resilient in body, mind, and moral sensibility. Ultimately, nostalgia for Victorian childhood was layered. Memories of endurance, labor, discipline, and moral instruction were intertwined with reflections on limitation, control, and the cost of conformity. Adults remembered the trials and discomforts, but they also recognized the skills, resilience, and moral awareness instilled. Childhood, in retrospect, was both harsh and formative, cruel and protective, demanding and instructive. The legacy of Victorian parenting was visible in adulthood, capable, disciplined, and morally aware, yet often nostalgic for the freedom never fully experienced. As the Victorian adult looked back, the question remained, was the severity of upbringing justified? Many concluded it was, viewing personal endurance, competence, and social grace as the evidence. Others remembered the discomfort, control, and psychological cost, questioning whether the relentless instruction had been necessary. Reflection was never simple, yet it was always profound. Childhood had been a crucible, and the adults who emerged carried both the scars and the lessons of its fire. This concludes the exploration of why Victorian parenting would be illegal today. From cradle to marriage, Victorian children was subjected to an intricate system of obedience, endurance, labor, discipline, and moral instruction, producing resilience and competence at the cost of freedom, spontaneity, and carefree childhood.